How does a company survive 40 years, then start collapsing 11 days after firing one employee? At 8:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the owner called me from the parking lot and said, "I think we made a mistake." They thought I was just the quiet operations manager they could replace with a cheaper hire. What they did not know was that I had spent 14 years building the systems that kept their biggest customers, their cash flow, and their reputation alive. Every story here is about someone who got underestimated and made them regret it. The company was called Halden Industrial Supply. For 40 years, they sold commercial parts to factories, warehouses, municipal contractors, and construction companies across 4 states. Bearings, valves, electrical components, safety equipment. Nothing glamorous. But when a manufacturing plant had a broken conveyor line at 2 a.m., or a city water department needed an emergency replacement pump, Halden was the company people called. At least, that was their reputation. Fast delivery. Accurate orders. Real people answering the phone. That reputation had been built long before I got there. But by the time I joined, it was being held together by a handful of people who understood what the company had become. I was one of them. I started in the warehouse at 24 years old. My first job was receiving shipments. I counted boxes, checked part numbers, caught damaged inventory, and learned very quickly that a single wrong digit could create a problem that lasted for weeks. A part labeled 48172 was not the same as 48127. One was a bearing assembly. The other was a seal kit. One could shut down a packaging line. The other could leave a customer waiting for a truck that never came. Those details mattered. Most people did not understand that until they had to explain a 6-figure delay to an angry customer. I understood it early. I worked my way from receiving to inventory control, then from inventory control to purchasing, then from purchasing to operations. By the time I was 38, I knew every part of Halden's business. I knew which customers paid late but always paid. I knew which sales reps promised delivery dates before checking stock. I knew which vendors were dependable, which ones needed constant follow-up, and which ones only treated us fairly because I had spent years building relationships with them. I knew that our biggest customer, North River Packaging, made up 18% of our annual revenue. I knew that their plant manager did not care about excuses. He cared whether the right part arrived before his line went down. I knew that our second largest customer only placed orders on Tuesdays and Thursdays because their purchasing manager had a system nobody else could understand. I knew that one particular freight carrier delivered cheaply but routinely lost overnight shipments heading west. And I knew that the company's accounting system looked clean only because I spent every Friday afternoon finding mistakes before they became disasters. My title was operations manager. But titles can be misleading. The owner, Richard Halden, liked to call me the backbone of the place. He said it at holiday dinners. He said it when customers complimented our service. He said it when he needed someone to fix a problem that nobody else could fix. Then he hired his son. His name was Mason. Mason was 29. He had spent 2 years working for a consulting company in Chicago, where he learned how to build presentations about businesses he had never operated. Richard introduced him at the quarterly meeting as the future of Halden. Mason stood in front of 72 employees wearing a bright white shirt, expensive shoes, and the confidence of a person who had never been blamed for a missed shipment. He talked about modernization. He talked about efficiency. He talked about eliminating legacy thinking. Then he looked directly at me and said something I remembered for a long time. "We need to stop confusing experience with irreplaceability." The room got quiet. Not because people agreed with him. Because they knew exactly who he was talking about. Mason had a habit that became impossible to ignore. Whenever someone gave him a warning, he smiled first. Not a warm smile. A small, patient smile. The kind of smile a person gives when they believe they are listening to someone who simply has not caught up yet. Then he would say, "I hear the concern." Not, "I understand." Not, "Let's look at the data." Just, "I hear the concern." It was his polite way of dismissing people. And he dismissed a lot of people. He dismissed the warehouse supervisor when she warned that cutting evening staff would slow down emergency orders. He dismissed the purchasing coordinator when he said switching vendors would save 9%. He dismissed the controller when she told him that extending customer payment terms would hurt cash flow. And he dismissed me when I told him Halden could not run on instinct anymore. We had grown too large. Our systems were too old. Our relationships were too important. The company had survived 40 years because people knew what they were doing. Mason seemed to believe it had survived 40 years because nobody had been brave enough to disrupt it. For 6 months, I tried to work with him. I gave him reports. I walked him through our vendor agreements. I showed him why certain processes existed. I explained the risks in numbers, timelines, and plain language. He nodded. He smiled. He said, "I hear the concern." Then he did the opposite. By spring, he announced a restructuring plan. He called it Halden Forward. He was proud of that name. The plan cut 7 warehouse positions. It moved purchasing decisions to a centralized approval system. It reduced the number of approved suppliers. It forced sales reps to use a new order portal that had never been tested during high-volume weeks. And it removed my authority to approve emergency inventory purchases without Mason's sign-off. That last change was the one that mattered most. Emergency purchasing was not glamorous. Nobody noticed it when it worked. But it was how we kept customers from leaving when a shipment was delayed, a supplier failed, or a storm closed a highway. I told Mason exactly what would happen. Not eventually. Not theoretically. I told him the first major disruption would expose the entire company. He smiled. "I hear the concern," he said. Then, 3 weeks later, I was called into a meeting at 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday. Richard was there. Mason was there. The HR consultant was there. And on the table was a folder with my name on it. Mason said the company was moving in a new direction. Richard said they appreciated my years of service. The HR consultant said my position had been eliminated. Just like that. 14 years. A company I had helped stabilize through supply shortages, staffing crises, and 2 warehouse floods. Gone. Mason said they needed someone better aligned with the future. Then he gave me that small smile. I know this may be difficult to hear. I looked at him. Then I looked at Richard. And I asked one question. Who is taking over the vendor continuity files? Mason leaned back in his chair. We have a team for that now. I nodded. Then I asked, who has the emergency pricing authority? He said, finance will handle that. I asked, who is the escalation contacts for North River? He smiled again. I hear the concern. That was the moment I knew they had no idea what they had done. But I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not list all the things they would lose without me. I signed the separation paperwork. I turned in my badge. I packed my family photo, my coffee mug, and a small desk plant my daughter had given me 3 years earlier. Then I walked out of Halden Industrial Supply at 5:18 p.m. Mason watched from the glass office near the front entrance. He looked satisfied. He thought he had removed a problem. What he had really done was remove the person who knew where every hidden weakness was buried. There was one thing Mason never asked about before he fired me. 8 months earlier, I had created a vendor continuity file after a major supplier nearly failed us. It was not stored in my desk. It was not a secret. It was part of a documented contingency process that required one specific approval before anyone could use it. Mason had never read the policy. In 11 days, that oversight would bring a 40-year-old company to its knees. The morning after I was fired, I woke up at 6 a.m. out of habit. For 14 years, I had started most days before sunrise. There was always something to check. A late truck. A back-ordered part. A customer escalation. A supplier who had promised a shipment by Thursday and suddenly stopped answering the phone. But that Friday, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table. No urgent emails. No warehouse call. No sales rep asking if I could just make something happen. For the first time in years, the silence felt strange. At 8:14 a.m., I received my first message. It was from a sales rep named Tom. Tom had worked at Halden for 9 years. He was good at his job, and he knew when something was serious. His message said, "Did they really let you go?" I did not respond. 10 minutes later, another message appeared. North River has an issue. Mason says he has it handled. That was all it said. I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I put my phone face down. I had been told my position was eliminated. I had been given a separation agreement. I was no longer responsible for Halden's problems. That should have been simple. But when you spend 14 years keeping a business moving, it is difficult to switch off the part of your mind that sees consequences before they happen. I knew what the North River issue probably was. Their main packaging facility had a recurring failure point in one of its conveyor systems. Every few months, a specific drive assembly needed replacement. Normally, we kept 2 in stock because the manufacturer had an 8-week lead time. But Mason's new inventory policy had changed that. He had cut excess stock. He liked that phrase. Excess stock. To him, it meant inventory that had not moved fast enough to look efficient on a spreadsheet. To me, it meant the parts that kept your largest customer operating when something went wrong. 3 days before I was fired, I had seen the inventory report. The last drive assembly for North River had been shipped to another customer. The reorder had not been placed because Mason's centralized approval system was waiting on a finance review. I had flagged it. I had copied Mason. I had copied Richard. I had written, North River is exposed if their line experiences failure before replenishment arrives. Mason replied 15 minutes later. I hear the concern. We cannot continue carrying inventory based on worst-case scenarios. That was his answer. Now North River had an issue. By 10:30 a.m., I had received 4 more messages. A warehouse employee told me the North River plant had a conveyor failure overnight. A purchasing assistant said Mason was trying to locate the part. Tom said the customer was threatening to source it directly from a competitor. Then, at 11:07 a.m., Mason called me. I let it ring. He called again. I let it ring again. On the 3rd call, he left a voicemail. His tone was different from the day before. Less polished. More urgent. Call me back. It's about North River. We need to clarify a few things. Clarify. That was a new word for him. Not, I hear the concern. Not, we have a team. Clarify. I listened to the voicemail once. Then I deleted it. At noon, I received an email from the HR consultant. She said Mason wanted to know whether I had any information regarding the North River inventory status. I replied with one sentence. Relevant status updates, including the projected stockout risk, were documented in the operations report sent Tuesday at 3:42 p.m. That was it. No lecture. No satisfaction. Just a timestamp. At 1:20 p.m., the HR consultant replied that she had located the report. At 1:28 p.m., Mason called again. This time I answered. He did not say hello. He said, "Where did you put the emergency drive assemblies?" I paused. Then I said, "There were no emergency drive assemblies." He went quiet. I continued. "The last unit shipped last week. The replenishment request was pending your approval." He said, "There has to be another source." "There is," I said. "Who?" "The supplier listed in the continuity file." "Where is that?" "In the vendor continuity file." "I know that," he said sharply. "Where is the file?" "It is in the operations continuity folder. The location is documented in the separation checklist." Another pause. Then he said, "I cannot access it." That was the first visible crack. Mason had fired me. He had taken over my responsibilities. But he could not access the process designed to save the company during an emergency. I did not enjoy that. I noticed it. There is a difference. I said, "Then you should contact IT or review the continuity policy." He exhaled through his nose. "I need you to tell me the supplier." I said, "I am no longer employed by Halden. This could cost us North River." "I understand." "You understand?" he said. "Then why are you being difficult?" I kept my voice level. "I am not being difficult. I am complying with the separation agreement and protecting myself from performing unauthorized work." He said nothing. Then he ended the call. That afternoon, North River rented a temporary replacement unit from a regional equipment company. It cost them $42,000 for a single weekend. The plant stayed open. But the damage had started. Their plant manager sent Halden a formal notice demanding an explanation, reimbursement, and a written assurance that future emergency inventory would be available. Mason answered with a 2-page email about new operational efficiencies. That was his first mistake. not the inventory decision, not even firing me. His first visible mistake was believing that a customer in crisis wanted a presentation instead of a solution. North River's plant manager replied with 8 words. Please stop explaining and start delivering. That email went to Richard. It went to Mason. It went to finance. And it went to every sales rep assigned to the account. By Monday, people at Halden were nervous. I knew because my phone kept buzzing. The warehouse supervisor sent me a message. Things are getting strange. I did not ask for details. I was no longer inside the company. But she told me anyway. Mason had called an all-hands meeting at 9 a.m. He told everyone the North River issue was a temporary exception. He said the new system was working. He said there would be some resistance from employees attached to old methods. Then he announced that no one was allowed to contact me about company matters. That last part made several people in the room look at each other. Because Mason had spent all weekend trying to contact me. By Tuesday, the next problem arrived. It was bigger. Halden's primary electrical supplier, Vesper Components, sent a notice that they were suspending Halden's credit line. The amount was not huge by corporate standards. $680,000. But for a privately owned distribution company with tight cash flow, it was a wall. Vesper had extended Halden favorable terms for years. Net 60 days. Priority allocation during shortages. Early access to limited inventory. Mason thought those terms existed because Halden had buying power. They did not. They existed because I had built a relationship with Vesper's regional director over a decade. When their warehouse caught fire in 2021, I had redirected 3 customers to alternate sources instead of demanding inventory they could not provide. When they had a quality issue with a shipment, I worked with them quietly instead of publicly blaming them. When our invoices were delayed because of an accounting migration, I called before they had to chase us. That is what business relationships look like when they are real. They are not just contracts. They are memory. Mason did not understand that. He had told the purchasing team to move 60% of our electrical orders to a new vendor offering lower prices. He wanted a quick savings number for his Halden Forward presentation. The new vendor had promised 12% lower costs. What Mason had not noticed was that their delivery performance was poor, their warranty process was slow, and their inventory data was often wrong. Vesper noticed the shift. Then they noticed that several invoices were overdue. Then they noticed that nobody at Halden was returning their calls. So they suspended the credit line. Mason called me at 7:46 p.m. that Tuesday. I almost did not answer. But curiosity got the better of me. He said, "Did you know Vesper was going to do this?" I said I knew they were concerned. "Why did you not tell me?" "I did. Twice." "No, I mean specifically. I told you their relationship depended on communication and volume consistency." He said, "That is vague." I said, "It was not vague when I wrote it. It became vague when you ignored it." He went silent. Then he tried to sound calm. "Can you call them for me?" There it was. The request he had not imagined making 6 days earlier. I asked him in what capacity. He said, "As someone who knows them." I said, "I know them because I spent years representing Halden." "I do not represent Halden anymore." He said, "You are seriously going to let this happen?" I took a breath. Then I answered carefully. I did not suspend their credit line. I did not move their business. I did not ignore their calls. And I did not fire the person responsible for vendor continuity without assigning a replacement. He said nothing. Then he hung up. The next morning, I spoke to an attorney. Not because I was looking for revenge. Because I wanted clarity. Halden had included a standard confidentiality clause in my separation agreement. That was normal. I had no interest in sharing their information, contacting their clients, or causing any damage. But the attorney confirmed something important. I was not obligated to provide unpaid consulting services. I was not obligated to answer operational questions. And if the company wanted my help, they needed to make a written offer with clear terms. At 10:13 a.m., Halden's HR consultant emailed me. Would I be willing to assist with a short-term transition? I replied that I would review a formal consulting proposal. At 11:40 a.m., the proposal arrived. It offered me my old hourly rate. No minimum hours. No advance payment. No defined authority. And no protection from being blamed for decisions I did not make. They wanted the knowledge. They wanted the relationships. They wanted the rescue. But they wanted it for the same rate they paid me before they decided I was not aligned with the future. I declined. Politely. Then I sent my own proposal. A 60-day consulting agreement. Weekly payment in advance. A 6-hour minimum for any day I was scheduled. Defined authority over vendor continuity, emergency purchasing, and customer recovery plans. And one condition that mattered most. Mason could not alter operational decisions within my scope without written approval from Richard and the controller. That was not personal. It was practical. Mason had already proven that he would overrule people, ignore warnings, and then rewrite the story when the consequences arrived. I was not going back into that system without boundaries. At 2:05 p.m., Richard called me himself. His voice sounded older than it had the week before. He said he wanted to talk. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop away from the office. When he walked in, he looked tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Tired. He sat down across from me and said, "I did not know Mason was going to eliminate your role that quickly." I looked at him. "Did you approve it?" He stared at his coffee. Then he nodded. That was the real problem. Richard had built Halden over 4 decades. He knew the customers. He knew the history. But he had slowly stepped away from the details, and Mason had stepped into the empty space with confidence. Richard said he thought the company needed change. I told him change was not the issue. A company can modernize. A company can improve systems. A company can cut waste. But it cannot remove the people who understand the business before it understands what those people actually do. He asked if I would come back. I said, not as an employee. He looked up. I handed him the consulting proposal. He read it slowly. Then he said, "Mason is not going to like this." I said, "Mason does not have to like it. He just has to decide whether he wants the company to keep losing customers." That was the moment the balance changed. For 14 years, I had asked for resources, approvals, and support. Now the owner of the company was asking me for a way back. If you have ever been told you were replaceable by people who never understood your job, subscribe, because this is where the people who underestimated me started realizing how expensive that decision was. Richard signed the agreement that afternoon. Mason did not. He had no choice. The following morning, I walked back into Halden Industrial Supply as a consultant. No employee badge. No desk in the back office. No reporting line to Mason. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., walked through the warehouse, and saw what 11 days of bad decisions looked like. Orders waiting because purchasing approvals had not cleared. Sales reps manually tracking inventory because the new portal was showing inaccurate stock levels. Boxes stacked in the wrong shipping lane because the evening crew had been cut. 3 customer orders marked expedite with no freight carrier assigned. And a whiteboard near dispatch with the words "North River callback" written in red marker. That was not a system. That was panic with office supplies. I met with the warehouse supervisor first, then the controller, then the purchasing coordinator, then the sales team. I asked one question in every meeting. What is the problem nobody wants to say out loud? The answers came quickly. The new supplier was missing delivery dates. The reduced warehouse staff could not process emergency orders after 5 p.m. Finance approvals were taking 2 days for purchases that needed 2 hours. And customers were starting to call competitors. The most serious problem came from the controller. She closed her office door and showed me a cash flow report. Vesper's credit suspension had triggered a chain reaction. Without their credit line, Halden had to pay for certain inventory up front. Without inventory, sales orders were delayed. With delayed sales orders, customers were holding payments. And with customers holding payments, the company was falling behind on freight bills and vendor invoices. The company was not bankrupt. Not yet. But it was running out of room. Then she showed me something else. A list of customer contracts due for renewal in the next 30 days. North River was first. Then a municipal water supplier. Then a regional manufacturing group worth $7.8 million annually. All 3 had been assigned to Mason's strategic modernization team. All three had active complaints. That was the point of no return. Because at that moment, I understood the company was not facing one bad week. It was facing a collapse of trust. And trust is the one thing you cannot fix with a spreadsheet. I spent the next 4 days building a recovery plan. Not a presentation. Not a motivational speech. A plan. First, I called Vesper Components. I did not ask them for a favor. I acknowledged what Halden had done. I told them the company had mishandled communication and that I had been brought back with specific authority to correct the situation. Their regional director knew me. He did not make it easy. He said trust had been damaged. He said his team had been ignored. He said Halden had treated a 10-year relationship like a price comparison. I told him he was right. Then I gave him a concrete plan, a payment schedule, a minimum monthly purchase commitment, a direct escalation line, and written confirmation that purchasing decisions involving their account would no longer be made by Mason alone. By the end of the call, Vesper agreed to restore a limited credit line. Not the full $680,000. Not immediately. But enough to release the inventory we needed for North River and 2 other critical accounts. That was the first step. Then I called North River's plant manager. He did not want to talk. I did not blame him. I asked for 10 minutes. He gave me 5. I told him I was not calling to explain Halden forward, internal changes, or operational efficiencies. I was calling to give him exact dates. The replacement drive assembly would arrive Thursday at 6 a.m. We would hold 1 additional unit at our warehouse by the following Tuesday. I would send him a weekly inventory report for the next 90 days. And if Halden missed any committed emergency response time, I would personally be the first person he called. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why was this not handled like that last week?" I said, "Because last week, the people making promises were not the people responsible for keeping them." He did not say anything for several seconds. Then he gave us one more chance. But there was a condition. North River wanted a meeting with Richard, Mason, and me. The following Monday, at 9 a.m., Richard agreed immediately. Mason did not want to go. He said it was unnecessary. He said I was creating drama around a routine vendor issue. That was almost impressive. Even after everything, he still thought the problem was the people pointing at the fire. Richard told him he would be there. Monday morning, we arrived at North River's plant. Their conference room overlooked the loading yard. Forklifts moved in the distance. Trucks came and went. And every minute of delay represented money somebody was losing. Their plant manager sat at the head of the table. Their operations director sat beside him. Their purchasing manager had a stack of documents in front of her. Mason began speaking before anyone asked him a question. He talked about transformation. He talked about a temporary adjustment period. He said Halden was improving its supply chain model. Then the operations director held up a printed copy of an email. It was the report I had sent before I was fired. The one warning that North River's emergency inventory was exposed. He looked at Mason and asked, "Did you receive this?" Mason glanced at the paper. Then he said, "I received a lot of reports during that period." The operations director asked again, "Did you receive this one?" Mason said, "Yes." Then the plant manager asked, "And what did you do about it?" Mason gave that familiar little smile. But this time, nobody was impressed. He said, "We were evaluating the best path forward." The purchasing manager slid another paper across the table. It was Mason's response. "I hear the concern. We cannot continue carrying inventory based on worst-case scenarios." The room went silent. Richard looked at the paper. Then he looked at his son. I had seen Richard angry before. But this was different. This was disappointment. Quiet and heavy. The plant manager looked at me. "Were you fired after sending this?" I answered honestly. "Yes." "Why?" I said, "I was told the company was moving in a new direction." The operations director leaned back in his chair. Then he said, "We have been a Halden customer for 19 years. We stayed because your company understood urgency. If this is the new direction, we need to know whether we should be looking elsewhere." That was the moment everything landed. Not just for Mason. For Richard. The company did not nearly fail because of one missed part. It nearly failed because leadership had confused cost-cutting with competence. They had removed safeguards because safeguards did not look efficient. They had dismissed experience because experience did not sound innovative. And they had fired the person who understood the difference between a process that looked old and a process that kept customers loyal. Richard spoke before Mason could. He told North River that Mason would no longer oversee operations. He said I had full authority over the recovery plan. And he said the company would honor every commitment I had made. Mason turned to his father. "Dad." Richard held up his hand. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just once. And Mason stopped speaking. North River did not renew their contract that day. They gave us 30 days. 30 days to prove Halden could still be trusted. That was not a victory. It was a test. But it was enough. Over the next month, I rebuilt what Mason had damaged. We restored emergency inventory levels. We rehired 3 warehouse employees who had been cut. We ended the agreement with the unreliable low-cost supplier. We put purchasing approvals back where they belonged, with people who understood the consequences of delays. We rebuilt the Vesper relationship, one invoice, one call, and one kept promise at a time. And we stopped pretending the company could survive on slogans. At the end of those 30 days, North River renewed. Not for 3 years. Not yet. For 1 year. They wanted proof before trust. That was fair. But the company survived. Then came the part nobody expected. Richard asked me to meet him after hours. We sat in his office, the same office where he had told me my position was eliminated. The same room where Mason had smiled and said I was not aligned with the future. Richard looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I thought I was protecting the company by preparing my son to lead it." I said nothing. He continued. Instead, I let him tear apart the things he did not understand. Then he made me an offer. Chief Operating Officer. Equity in the company. Authority to rebuild operations. And a salary that was more than double what I had earned before. For a moment, I considered it. 14 years is a long time. I knew the employees. I knew the customers. I knew how much the company meant to people who had spent their careers there. But then I looked at the office around us. The same old furniture. The same framed photos from company anniversaries. The same place where I had been treated as essential until I was inconvenient. And I understood something. They did not just fire me. They showed me exactly how fragile my position had always been. So I thanked Richard. And I declined. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. I finished my 60-day consulting agreement. I stabilized the systems. I trained the people who had been ignored. I documented every process so no one person could ever again be dismissed without the company understanding the consequences. Then I left. This time on my own terms. 6 months later, I heard that Halden had been sold. Not because it failed overnight. Because the damage had exposed what Richard could no longer deny. The company had survived 40 years. But it did not survive the leadership decision to fire the person holding its operational memory together. The buyer kept the warehouse. They kept some of the staff. They kept the name for a while. But Halden Industrial Supply, as the company Richard built, was gone. And Mason? He was never put back in charge. The lesson is not that you should make yourself impossible to replace by hiding information or keeping secrets. That kind of power is fragile. It turns you into a hostage to your own job. The real goal is different. Know your rights. Know your value. And document the work that people only notice when it is missing. If you manage relationships, processes, systems, customers, or revenue, keep a record of your responsibilities. Write down the risks you raise. Save the reports you send. Confirm major decisions in writing. Not because you expect betrayal every day. Because when someone makes a bad decision, memory becomes flexible. People suddenly forget warnings. They forget who owned a process. They forget who approved a change. But emails, policies, timelines, and clear documentation do not forget. And if your employer ends your role, understand what you are obligated to do and what you are not obligated to do. Do not perform unpaid work because someone creates an emergency. Do not let urgency erase your boundaries. You can be professional without being available for exploitation. You can be calm without being weak. And you can leave a company with your head high while still making sure the truth is impossible to rewrite. Being untouchable does not mean no one can fire you. Anyone can fire anyone. Being untouchable means that your reputation, your records, your skills, and your options survive after someone makes the mistake of underestimating you. The next case starts with a director who laid off his entire night shift to impress investors before an earnings call. He thought the remaining team could cover the workload for one weekend. Then, at 2:13 a.m., a single machine failed, a $12 million order disappeared, and the only technician who knew the override code was sitting at home with a severance check. Subscribe, because when that director finally calls him, the technician does not ask for his job back.